We're thrilled to have Anja and Manuel join us today. Anja, thanks for making time. We've shared your really extraordinary bio with our class already, and it's seeing this and knowing how busy you are, we sure appreciate you joining us today.
So happy to be here, Joe. And these are great courses you're teaching and the best minds at Stanford looking at these important problems. So happy to chat with you.
Thank you again. Anja, you have so many areas of expertise, and I think today we'll kind of focus on technology, China, competition, and other aspects. But we know China is a big competitor. Our national security strategy, national defense strategy, which the students are familiar with, they appreciate that we are in long-term competition with China. Could you give us your thoughts on where is China winning? Where do we really need to be worried about? And maybe we'll get into a little bit later what can we do about that?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So when you look at US media reports today, China is always portrayed as 10 feet tall. They're the biggest economy, they're catching up in AI, they're dominating 5G. Some, but not all of those things are true. And this isn't a course about China, but I will just tell you that it is true that China is rapidly catching up in terms of innovation. 5 years ago, if you talk to Silicon Valley, they'd say, well, the Chinese are good tinkerers, but they're not really so great. Now they would say, wow, they're really good at AI, not the academic piece of AI, but tinkering with the models. They're really first rate. They are catching up rapidly in semiconductors, even though the US still has the lead. Quantum, no one really knows because it's very hush-hush, and all of that is 5 to 10 years out. But Chinese scientists are doing some great work on that. They're doing some great work in biology. And so it is still the case that in all of the technical disciplines that are going to determine our future and this competition with China, the US and the West are still in the lead. But if you've ever seen that rear view mirror and the sign that says objects are closer than they appear, that's where China is now, right in the rear view mirror. And if we don't look carefully, they'll catch up and they'll surpass us in a lot of technologies that are relevant to defense and relevant to our general competitiveness.
Thank you. Well, we know in this competition with China that, of the many areas we're going to need to compete, maintaining our edge in innovation is going to be critical to whether we prevail or not. So what are your thoughts on how we might restructure our government to be maybe like an innovation superpower, if you will?
Small question like that. Exactly. Perfect. Well, I've got some ideas. I have a plan for that, like Elizabeth Warren says. We are getting a little bit comfortable with our lead. And if you look at where we were during World War II and right after World War II, there was a huge push on US innovation. The superpower in the world has always had the most advanced technology. You don't really think about it, but Roman paved roads, Chinese gunpowder, British ships and repeating firearms. And then the United States, really since World War II, we've been completely dominant in technologies from nuclear to the internet. Well, as we said just before, that's no longer completely the case. And there are a couple of things that I would do to reorganize our government around this, some very hard and some easy. One, we need much more competence inside the US government about technology. There used to be an office inside Congress that gave technical advice. It has been disbanded. I know a lot of people, and I think you have Ash Carter talking to this, I'm sure he'll say we need to reconstruct it because he worked there once upon a time. In the White House, you have the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. You have a grandiosely named CTO of the United States, who, as best I can tell, has almost no power. I would advocate creating something like a Deputy National Security Advisor for Tech. You don't need a bunch of new institutions inside the White House. You just put that inside the NSC and you give them convening power, the power to call together the Deputies Committee to talk about these different issues, because the issue isn't that no one is looking at the different technical problems. The problem is that they're really complex. Most of the people in the different departments don't have the specialized expertise that they need on AI, on semiconductors, on 5G, and there's very little coordination. So when you see what the Trump administration has done, it has been almost entirely defensive. You know, tighten up our investment controls, make really tough new investment restrictions so Chinese can't buy American companies. Now, basically shut down any American company selling anything to Huawei. That's okay. Some of that was all right and was long overdue, but a lot of it, in my view, is overreach, and it wasn't coordinated with private industry that has to implement this stuff, and it wasn't coordinated between departments. So the way you restructure the US government is not by creating some new ministry, but by coordinating more effectively between the departments that are already there. I have 10 more ideas, but I'll just stop there. We can go more into it later.
I know our students are furiously taking notes on this. This is a wonderful prescription, Anja. And we have a few required readings for this course. And one reading we encourage students to be familiar with is Chris Brose's new book, Kill Chain, former SAS staffer, which I'm sure you know.
Yep, old friend of mine from the State Department. I'm an old friend. And another thing you might consider, because it's really short, is Pav Singh from DIU and I wrote a piece on exactly this. How do you compete with China on technology? It's very short, so I'll send it to you after this.
It's on the reading list. It's going to be there in real time. TAs, if you heard that, I hope this is on before the end of class. I think Chris had a number of great quotes. One memorable one for me and one that I'd like you to respond to is, he says that the problem is not lack of money, lack of technology, and certainly not lack of capable and committed people in the US government, military, and private industry. No, he says the problem is a lack of imagination. I mean, do you agree with this? And if so, how can we better harness the power of our collective imagination?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that wholeheartedly, not just because Chris is an old friend, but especially on the Defense Department side, which is a lot of what the class is focusing on. You know this better than anyone. Acquisitions is old and painful and boring and staffed by people who couldn't find an algorithm if it hit them in the face, right? So we are still doing things we are still prioritizing gigantic platforms, RFPs, 18-month cycles over fast iterations, quick fails, sometimes using technologies that aren't. One of the big problems, and I think what Chris means by lack of imagination, is we have the military think about what is the widget we want, and then we pay someone a ridiculous amount of money to build it. When often you don't even know what you want or need. Nobody thought they wanted or needed an iPhone before Steve Jobs created it. No one thought they wanted and needed also an iPad and an Apple phone and Siri and all of these other things, and Apple Watch, sorry, all of these other things that technology has given to us that we didn't plan for 30 years out. I think there's a famous quote, you may have it in a different part of the class, but I know Bill Perry at some point said, who used to teach one of these classes, he testified before Congress in the late 70s and was asked if, you know, the personal computer would ever be important. And he said, no way. Right? So the lack of imagination is, we're not really sure what we're going to need 5 years from now. So we have to be much more agile and flexible in buying what we need. And that means completely empowering and emphasizing the few things that are there doing that, DIU, DARPA, a couple of others. But if you look at the scale of it, big defense acquisition is here, and those efforts are down here. So I think I would agree with them, and that's what I would say is a lack of imagination.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing China can't steal or acquire is imagination. And I really think that's one of our comparative advantages, but thank you for your thoughts on that. Anja, I don't know how you find time to publish in leading journals with all the other many irons in the fire you have, but you had a great recent foreign affairs article. And of the many points you make, I found this one very compelling. And to quote you, you say, rather than focusing on blocking Chinese advancement, the United States should push its own defense sector to be more agile and innovative, not by emulating civil military fusion, but by working with rather than dictating to actors outside of governments. So Anja, how can we do this? How can we push our defense sector to be more agile and more innovative?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for raising that. So it's an article I just wrote this summer with Kat Hicks, who runs the Defense Studies program at CSIS. She's a wonderful mutual friend. And the point of the article was really kind of to make the point that I made in the beginning here, which is, yes, China is important and they're catching up, but we can do this. We've done this before. We've out-innovated the Soviet Union. We can do this again. And the beginning of that article actually talks about civ-mil fusion, which you hear tossed around all the time, the idea that the Chinese have this perfect coordination between their private sector and the PLA, the Chinese military, and the Chinese government on all things technology. When you dig into that a little deeper, it's like many other things in China. The president and his team, Xi Jinping, issue a proclamation, and then everybody tries to echo it. And then people put money into it and people create an industrial park here. Nobody knows exactly how much budget there is for this, which may mean that there's a lot, but more likely means that maybe there's less there than meets the eye. It's not particularly well coordinated, and the money that is there, a lot of it will be wasted. That's not to say we shouldn't think about it and address it accordingly, but it just means we don't need to overreact, and we certainly don't need to out-China China. So what do I mean by that? The Chinese say, for example, anything invented in our private sector, we have to be able to use for the PLA. That's a paraphrase, but that's roughly there. Obviously, that's not where we're going, right? We have a capitalist system, we have a democracy. We're not going to suddenly force Google to cooperate with the Department of Defense on Project Maven, for example. But boy, we can do some of the things that we talked about just now when we were discussing Chris Brose's book. You can have a lot more expertise about technology in DoD, the people who are making the defense acquisition decisions. You can say, well, here's a big bucket of money, not the 200 billion or whatever it is we spend on ATL, but significant in the tens of billions. That's going to be money that's more spent like not actually a venture fund, but more like a venture fund. Small bets on what might become the next iPhone, what might become the next technology that we don't even know we need yet, as we just discussed. And you could have a whole, system around that. So that's what I mean. I don't mean dictating to our private sector what to do, but I mean incentivizing them to do the right thing. There's another piece that gets really in the weeds, but you guys are all taking these classes, so you're interested in the weeds. The way we incentivize innovation in this country for the private sector has been warped a little bit. So when you look at the 50s and 60s, sort of the height of the Cold War, there was a huge amount of federal government funding for basic science research and development. At its height, 2% of our GDP. That's enormous. That has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk down to where it's now like 0.7% of our GDP. It should go up. It doesn't need to go up all the way up to 2%, but maybe it should go up to 1%, something like that. But that's basic science, because out of basic science come all of these other things, like the internet started as a basic science project. Lasers were a basic science project where everybody thought, oh, well, that's a solution without a problem. Turns out they're pretty useful for a whole number of things. All sorts of things like that. So we need to do that. And then on the private sector incentive side, we give tax incentives for R&D, right? So if you are a tech startup, like you're all going to start when you leave here, when you leave Stanford, you make something new, you can deduct all of your expenses of developing that new technology from the profits that you make as a company. That's the right thing. But over the years, that has become eroded. So you have the same R&D tax credit for making a new craft beer, which is great. We all like craft beer, as you do for having a microchip. And so one is much more strategically important to the United States than others. So maybe you have a differential there, right? Maybe you support the industries that we really care about and less so much the other ones.
Great, thank you, Anja. I'm shifting gears a bit here. I had a chance to serve in OSD policy for a couple years, 2017 to 2019. And certainly under then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, a lot of emphasis on our national defense strategy's line of effort too, which is strengthening alliances and building new partnerships. I wonder if you could kind of describe the potential role for allies and partners, potentially like India, for example, in building this innovation capability that you described.
Yep. Yeah, allies and partners are super important.
And I mean, maybe even broader in the broader China competition, the role of allies and partners. I know we've talked in the past about, for example, the role of the big democracies in the Indo-Pacific region, the Quad countries, India, Japan, and Australia. But just thoughts on working with allies and partners in the, the innovation capability and any other areas of the China competition.
Yep. I mean, you're the big expert in alliances and partnerships with in the traditional military sense with your friends around the world. This is a big benefit that we have, a big strength that the United States has that China just doesn't. China doesn't really have any friends. We, when we're not fighting with them, have a lot of friends. The NATO alliance is one of the great innovations of the world. It is important. We need to keep it going. Our bilateral, our one-on-one alliances in Asia are very important. People sometimes talk about, do you need an Asian NATO? I don't see that ever happening in the near future because there's just a series of bad bilateral relationships there, as you well know, Joe. But the Chinese don't have this. The Chinese have states, even historically, when you look back 500, 600 years, they have vassal states where China is the important power and someone else kowtows to them and says, well, I will, be your feudal underling. And they have sort of friends of convenience. Russia, for example, is a friend of convenience of China. That alliance is not as strong or real as meets the eye. We're kind of pushing the two of them together. So you see lots of military parades and exercises between the Chinese and the Russians. But ask the Russians about the Chinese and they're pretty racist. And ask the Chinese about the Russians and they say, well, I had this interesting conversation with a Chinese businessman about this. And he said, oh, I don't invest in Russia. There's no rule of law there. So there's no trust. There's no real trust between the two, like there is real trust between the US and the Five Eyes, right? For example. So, I think you and I are in wholehearted agreement. We got to keep our alliances strong. On the more specific piece of alliances and how do you deal with innovation, this gets much more complicated because it's not really what governments are set up to do. We're really good at how do you exercise with India more? Do you have exercises with the Quad? Do you not? That's sort of in our lane. We're decent at, let's do this trade negotiation, or not. These days, more not than we do it. Technology and innovation is much harder because by definition, it involves governments, the private sector, and academic institutions. And so what I've written about with Pav Singh and others, and people are now kind of more and more calling for a form of, is what I call a technology 10 of countries that are interested in innovation, see the competition in technology with China the same way that we do. Not that China necessarily has to become our enemy, but that China is going to be out there catching up very rapidly, and boy, we better innovate or else. And so what do I mean by a technology 10? It wouldn't be one fixed thing that is always the same. So for example, you wouldn't want to create another OECD or the International Telecommunications Union with a big bureaucracy that, puts out white papers but doesn't do very much. What we mean is something really flexible. So you could imagine a working group on semiconductors that, of course, I keep talking about semiconductors. Those are important because that's basically the chips that everything else rests on. If you don't have compute and storage, you can't do anything else. So that's why I keep talking about it. So you could imagine having a subgroup on semiconductors that involves, in that case, probably the US, the UK, the Netherlands, because they're really sophisticated in this, and maybe and Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. And you think through, how do we make sure we stay the most innovative? Do we need all the fabs to be in these Western countries? Are there certain things that none of us will export to China because just the US having an export ban isn't very useful if the Dutch then sell it to the Chinese? That kind of stuff. You could imagine a separate grouping that's on 5G. That would include Norway, but probably not the Dutch, right? Another grouping on AI that would include India, but others probably wouldn't. And for each of these, you think through, what are the narrowly tailored things that we don't want to do with China? The assumption being on most areas we'll still cooperate. And then what can we do in our own systems to make sure that we're still in the innovation lead? So that's what I mean by that. It's a hard thing to start. Pav and I have started really seeding it. We've chatted a lot with the UK government about it. They have a form of it now that they're calling the D10. It's just a small subset of this. I saw that just today. I don't know if you saw, Joe, that Esper put out something saying that he is cooperating with other defense departments on AI. That's good. It's probably smaller, but the more of this kind of stuff can be happening, the better.
Thank you. Thank you, Anja. There's so much material out there online that I had the chance to review that you've put out. Again, I had to cherry pick a few things. And one was what I thought was a really compelling TED Talk that you gave not too long ago. And of the points you made, I thought this one was very compelling. And you say that we must become patriots again, rather than just focus on becoming unicorns. This is really a goal of our class, to expose students to some of the incredible people serving, in various government roles, and create opportunities for our students to feel like they're serving and contributing in some way. But what did you mean by this comment of becoming patriots again? And how do you recommend that we act on what this seems to be a call to action on your part?
Yeah, it's definitely a call to action. And you and I, we've been friends for years and chatted about this. And I actually, when I still had time to teach at Stanford, taught a class kind of at the intersection of technology and public policy. I know exactly. I want to come back to it. But I feel like there's that phrase, let's take it in two parts. One, what I meant by that phrase in the TED Talk is our tech companies need to become patriotic again. And then I think we should have a separate conversation about what can we all do and what can the students do. But let me take the companies first. The reason I said that in the TED Talk is because the TED Talk covered a little bit what we talked about today. Where is China? Is it really catching up? What can we do about it? And a lot of the what can we do about it are the things that we've just discussed here. It's at the international level with the Tech 10 and others. It's at the US government level. Better R&D, better STEM education. How do you organize yourself more effectively? How do you coordinate interagency? All the stuff we've just talked about. But the private sector has a role to play too. And, I don't see it playing that role. When you go back to the 50s and 60s, not that that they were so great in all respects, but the origins of Silicon Valley, as you and I have chatted about, was a really strong link between the federal government, especially the Pentagon, and great entrepreneurs out here. Fairchild Semiconductor, Varian, Hewlett-Packard, all of these companies had huge links with our government and our military. And they saw themselves as American companies. Fast forward to today, and until the trade war with China heated up, and a lot of our companies were getting a lot of their IP stolen by China, they saw themselves really as international global citizens, which is fine. And we don't want to stop that entirely. But I think if the Defense Department comes and says, hey, can you help us with a really basic visual recognition AI project like Project Maven? I think Google probably shouldn't say no, right? And that's now a kind of an old example, and maybe Google 3 years later wouldn't do that. But there are a lot of undercurrent examples like that, where tech companies feel like, well, we're global citizens, and that big bad government, they're not doing anything good. Sometimes not, but if you don't help, they won't ever change. So why don't we ensure that if we're going to shoot drones, that the targeting is really accurate and you're only hitting military targets and not civilians? Why shouldn't Silicon Valley provide the storage, through the Amazon cloud or whatever it is? Why shouldn't we use our innovation? And so we affirmatively here in the Valley also have a duty to reach out and help. It can't just be all, what more can the federal government give to me? That's what I meant by that.
On the second half, I might tee you up with another quote from your same TED Talk when you talk about what individuals can do beyond tech companies. And in that talk, you said that we are being called on now to make a once-in-a-generation effort to steer technology in the right direction. So our students, they're all self-selected young men and women who care about technology, they care about innovation and national security. But what advice would you have for this generation and how they can join this effort to steer technology on a better path?
Yep. You guys all in this Zoom room are going to be the ones doing it. I mean, Joe and I and us, middle-aged folks are trying, and we're starting down the path, but this is we're really in a new world, and I don't want to be too pessimistic, but it's a really dangerous world because you have a bunch of brand new technologies that are completely untested and for which there are no rules of the road. I just got off the phone with actually some folks, a Silicon Valley Foundation by some tech donors, which is great, who are doing a lot of work on how do you get to strategic stability in AI? So strategic stability is this Cold War term about nuclear weapons and the US and Russia and what we're renegotiating arms agreements. When I just had that discussion on AI, we don't even know what we would want, right? With nuclear weapons, it was easy. You want the ones that you have to be safe, and you want there to be fewer of them, and you want fewer countries to have them. That's super hard to answer in AI. Do you not want all countries to have the ability to build the really huge, powerful AI models that have, 100 trillion variables, things like that? Maybe. Do you want to say you can't have AI used in military without a kill switch, human in the middle? Like, just defining what you want in AI is incredibly complicated. And it's going to be up to you guys, people like you who are self-selected, who are taking these classes, talking between the techies and the fuzzies, the policy folks and the ones actually building the algorithms, to use this example, to come up with those, right? To come up with what does strategic stability mean. So that's one way that you can all help. Another way that you can help is that if you're going to start the tech company in Silicon Valley, think about what we're all saying in this class. Do something, even if it's more low margin and, it's not going to make you Snapchat right away. You're not going to get to $1 billion. Let's think about what you can do that would actually move the ball forward really from a technical standpoint, because so many of the companies that are getting funded now, we all know, are not technically innovative. They're just cool, right? TikTok is cool. Actually, that's a pretty good visual algorithm, but Snapchat is cool. They're not deeply technically innovative. So if you're going to be in the private sector, be deeply technically innovative and think about how you can also use that to help your country. If you're in the academic side, think about how do you create ethical parameters around all of these new technologies, and go into the government. I know Joe and I did it. It feels a little old-fashioned, but the government needs to make more opportunities for young people like you to serve without one of these traditional, really boring career paths. It's got to be easier to jump in and out, but please serve. You can do it for a few years. You can do it for your whole life. You'll have a whole different perspective on what it means to be an American and what it means to keep ourselves safe and free from war and innovative and prosperous. I'll leave it there.
All right, you're definitely motivating our students, Anja. Maybe we just have a few minutes left. Maybe just taking that point a bit more broadly, Anja. You've served in so many different capacities, government, private sector, a lot of time in academia, published author. Maybe just, if we could end the conversation with maybe some broad advice to our students. So you recommended they serve, but maybe how do you get there? How do you do it all? So some thoughts on how to, to pursue a path that, for example, you've followed that has led to so many opportunities to serve in so many different capacities.
Well, I'm going to turn that one right back at you in a minute.
I hear from me all the time.
But it's interesting to compare, right? So I came out of Stanford just like you. I think I took these classes that you're currently taking. And I went into investment banking for a while to pay off my student debt. And frankly, to learn a completely different world that I knew nothing about. Then I went to law school, but stayed very, very close always to the foreign policy community because that's what I was interested on. So Joe and I were just joking that, I was at the law school when he was at the Kennedy School, but we were both research assistants for Ash Carter, right? So you've got to stay involved and you've got to start writing. Even when I was a lawyer working on Supreme Court cases, I was writing stuff in foreign affairs and trying to stay engaged. Then by complete serendipity, my former Stanford professor became the Secretary of State, Condi Rice. So stay in touch with your professors. And so I worked for Condi, and then I came out of government, did law again for a while, and then Condi and Steve Hadley and I founded, Steve Hadley, who'd been our national security advisor, founded a strategic consulting firm that works at the intersection of some of the trends we've just discussed. And then Bob Gates, of course, joined us when he left being Secretary of Defense for Obama. So could I have predicted all of that when I was sitting in your shoes at Stanford? Absolutely not. But did I have a general idea of what I wanted to do and how I wanted to serve and be partly in the private sector and partly in? Absolutely. And, if the opportunity arises for all of you to serve in government service, please take it.
Well, thanks, Anja. So just thank you for your time and inspiration. Thank you for all you've done in so many important roles, but I'll be so bold as to say thank you in advance for what I suspect are some future roles that will support important causes and benefit us all. But thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you back here at Stanford very soon.
Thank you. Can't wait to see everyone on campus soon. Thanks for doing this, Joe. Bye.
Thanks, Anja.